can you explain the African origins of Islam?
The African origins of Islam. So that's an interesting question with a very, very interesting answer. So in my presentation, I highlighted the link between Africa and Arabia and the link between the foundation and the establishment of Islam and Africa. And I feel like that goes all the way back to, if we study some of the classical Islamic texts, such as the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, which is one of the first biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He elaborates within that biography that he traces his ancestry from a people in Egypt. And so he tells his companions that a day will come to them where they're able to travel to Egypt. And when they go to Egypt and they meet people with black skin and curly hair, that those people are their relatives through ancestry and their relatives through marriage. And what he meant by that and what he was referring to was the biblical and the Quranic figure of Hagar, or Hajar as she's known in Arabic, who was a black African woman. And she was the spouse of Abraham, or Ibrahim in the Islamic tradition. And according to the Islamic narrative, she was the first person to live in the city of Mecca. And so the story goes that Abraham or Ibrahim took her and left her in that valley, which is the valley of Mecca. And it was her son Ismail who then integrated with the Arabs from the tribe of Bani Jurhum, who came to her to trade water from the well of Zamzam that she had discovered there. And then from then he learnt the Arabic language and he integrated into the Arabs. But their origin came from the marriage or between Abraham and Hagar, and he describes Hagar as an African woman. So that begins the connection between Islam and Africa. And then as the lineage continues and continues to the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, something interesting is that in the beginning of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's mission, when he started to preach Islam and the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula were persecuting him and his followers, he sent a group of them to Ethiopia to seek refuge with the king of the Aksum Empire at the time, whose name was Ashama, or he's also known as Najashi, which was his title. And so he took in the early Muslim community. And so the first ever...
So that's the Ethiopian connection.
That's the Ethiopian connection. So the first ever freely practicing Muslim community in the world was established not in Mecca, where they were being persecuted, or in Medina, which was the city that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ established himself 8 years after this first migration. But it was the first migration to Africa, to East Africa, to Ethiopia, where the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, including his daughter Ruqayya and his Khalifa Uthman and his cousin Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, were able to found the first ever practicing Muslim community in East Africa.
And how did it spread to other places to practice freely?
So we know that there were the Arab conquests of North Africa, and that happened when the Khilafah or the Caliphate that was established, they expanded into Egypt, and then from Egypt into Tunisia, into Libya, and all the way into Morocco and all of those areas. And then once that had happened, they started to establish trade relations with West African kingdoms, sub-Saharan Africa. And so they were crossing the Sahara Desert with their camels and coming to West Africa to trade gold specifically. And so we have many accounts of empires that existed at that time, such as the Ghana Empire, which is not in modern day Ghana where we are now, but in Mali. There was the Mali Empire, which grew and later expanded, and we know the figure of Mansa Musa coming from that empire. There was the Susu Kingdom as well. There was the Takrur, which was a Fulani kingdom in northern Senegal. All of these kingdoms had trade relations with the North Africans, who were a mixture of Berbers and Arabs and Amazigh people, the native people who lived there, who had converted to Islam, and many of them had become Arabized. But what's interesting is that when we see the introduction of Islam into sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't come as a result of invasion, as some people believe. It doesn't come as a result of this trans-Saharan slave trade or the Arab slave trade, as people like to show or people like to say. But if we look at the accounts from the Africans themselves and from the Arabs themselves, we see a completely different narrative than the narrative that's usually given by, I like to call them Neo-Orientalist scholars, and I'll go into that later. But there's a book, for example, written by a Spanish scholar called Al-Bakri. And when I say Spanish, he was a Moor. He lived in Spain in the 1100s, so in the 1000s, in the 11th century. And he wrote a book called Kitabul Masalik wal Mamalik, the Book of Pathways and Kingdoms. And he wrote this book in Arabic. And what he tried to do was he tried to compile narratives of all of the major kingdoms that existed in the world and all of the major empires that existed in the world and the routes on how to get there and what people who had traveled there had experienced when they went there. So he interviewed a lot of the traders who had gone into West Africa to trade, and this is exactly 1,000 years ago. So think about the timeline, right? And 1,000 years ago, he describes the kingdom of Ghana, which was the most I would say, prosperous kingdom in West Africa and the wealthiest kingdom in West Africa, because they produced most of the world's gold at that time. And this was the predecessor or precursor to the Mali Empire and Mansa Musa, who came 300 years after. So when he describes the Ghana Empire, he says, the king is not Muslim. So the king was a practitioner of traditional African religion. And the king's court, the majority of them, are not Muslims. But the king is known for his love and friendship towards the Muslims. And the person in charge of his treasury, his interpreter, and most of his ministers are Muslim. And not only that, but he has 12 mosques in the capital city for the Muslims to pray. And he has built a mosque in his own palace for when he has guests so that they are able to pray. And so this is interesting in two aspects. It's interesting because, number one, if we look at the time when this is being written, this was before any North African invasions into West Africa or any alleged North African invasions into West Africa. In reality, none of that ever happened. North Africans had never invaded West Africa or ruled West Africa or subjugated West African people to slavery and colonization in the same way that Western people have. But if this is occurring in the year roughly 1035 or 1050, when this book is being written, that means that by that time, Islam had such a strong presence in West Africa that the capital city of the major kingdom in West Africa has 12 mosques and an extra mosque in the king's palace. And at that time, the king is still practicing traditional African religions, which means that the Muslims have not converted or forced the non-Muslims to convert to Islam, and the non-Muslims have not forced the Muslims to convert to Islam, but they're living side by side in West African society.
So it must have been a level of power in there to kind of push towards that tolerance.
There was a level of power, and there was also a level of appreciation that the way that Islam was spread in West Africa is completely different from the way it was spread in North Africa, because it wasn't spread through the expansion of the Islamic kingdom. It was spread through trade and through mutual understanding. Muslim Arab traders were coming in from the north, interacting with Africans who were then deciding to convert to Islam. And later we see there was an empire in northern Nigeria, and the framework of this empire still exists. It was called the Sokoto Khilafah, and it was established by a Fulani Muslim scholar called Uthman Dan Fodio. When Uthman Dan Fodio was writing about the history of West Africa and their interaction with Islam, he made it clear, and he said, according to what we've studied in history and according to the narratives that we have from our ancestors, black people in sub-Saharan Africa were never forced to convert to Islam, but rather they converted to Islam from their own free will. And he quotes an earlier scholar called Ahmed Baba, who was from Mali, who says the same thing. And he quotes the different books of history written by West Africans in West Africa, such as Tarikh al-Sudan and Tarikh al-Fattash, which also say the same thing. And this is a gripe that I have with a lot of people who speak about, number one, the relationship between Islam and West Africa, or the history of Islam in West Africa, is that for many people who speak about these things, specifically in a Western context, they never go to actual books written by Africans themselves. Mostly, I feel, because they don't have access to the language, because their books are mostly written in Arabic, or they're written in West African languages using Arabic script, which is called Ajami. But for many people, their narratives on West African history, unfortunately, even if they're people who describe themselves as Afrocentric, even if they're people who describe themselves as conscious, they come from Orientalist scholars and Western scholars and Western academia, which painted the history in a particular way. So there's the actual Orientalist scholarship, which is in the 18th and 19th century, and then there's the Neo-Orientalist scholarship, which is what I see as black scholars in the early 1900s studying books written by Westerners and then regurgitating the same information for the black community.
Can you clarify the term neo-Orientalist?
So Orientalism was a movement that was created in Western academia to depict people of the East, so the Orient. So it was any scholarship to do with Asia or Arab people, and by extension, North Africans and everything that was happening in all of these colonized territories. And so they had particular ways in which they would describe the histories and the cultures of these people to justify Western imperialism. And then when I say neo-Orientalist, is because after Orientalism, whose intention was to justify Western imperialism, ended, the black scholars that began to study in universities and write papers and write books in the early 1900s had no access to any resources other than the resources that were written by these Orientalist scholars, which is why you see many early black scholars who are university professors, graduates, etc., unfortunately regurgitating the same information that they inherited from their Orientalist predecessors. So I say neo-Orientalist, meaning new Orientalist. And this is the same kind of scholarship that unfortunately we see in the black community, where people are attacking, for example, Muslims and Islam in West Africa and saying certain things about West Africans' relationship with Islam and how Islam came into the region, which is based on Orientalist information and not based on African indigenous information. And the books are there. We have our own universities. We had our own scholars. If you think about the University of Sankore, for example, which was a university in Mali that was established in the mosque that was revived by Mansa Musa in 1327. At the height of this university, they had 25,000 students, and they had a library of over 700,000 manuscripts. And these manuscripts were written by Africans in Africa. And these manuscripts, not just only were they Islamic manuscripts, but they were manuscripts to do with history, to do with science, to do with mathematics, to do with all of these things. And even Google has a database collecting these manuscripts. They're digitizing them. If you type in Timbuktu manuscripts on Google, there's a whole Google page, and it's a Google funded project to preserve these manuscripts. But a lot of Africans and people in the diaspora don't have access to these manuscripts because they've been cut off from the Arabic language, which was the language of academia in West Africa, and they've been cut off from their native languages as well, because many of these books are written in Mandinka, they're written in Fulani, they're written in Suso, they're written in local dialects using the Arabic script as well. But if we study those manuscripts, we'll be able to have a better understanding of our history and what was going on in that time, rather than referring to Western imperialist, Orientalist academia and neo-Orientalist academia.